When a quiet young girl pressed a handful of coins into a stranger's weathered palm, she had no idea he wore colors that made grown men step aside. She didn't know that her small gesture would ripple through a network of leather and steel, or that by sunrise, hundreds of motorcycles would line her street, carrying men who'd traveled from distant cities to repay a debt the world couldn't measure. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Long before engines rumbled down her quiet street, before cameras arrived and neighbors whispered, there was just Maya, 11 years old, gentle-voiced, the kind of child who held doors open and said thank you to people who barely noticed. A young girl living in a weathered duplex on the edge of a forgotten neighborhood where hope felt as thin as the paint peeling from porches. Her grandfather, Papa Joe, always said Maya had a heart too big for such a small body, the kind that sensed hurt before it showed and offered comfort before it was asked for. Every day after school, Maya traded her backpack for responsibilities most kids never knew, sweeping sidewalks, carrying groceries for elderly neighbors, pulling weeds from gardens that weren't hers. Every coin she earned, every crumpled bill she tucked away, went into a mason jar on her windowsill. Written across it in faded marker, "College Fund." It wasn't much, mostly quarters and dollar bills, the occasional 5 from raking leaves or washing windows. Papa Joe told her it was her ticket out, a promise made in small change and big dreams. On a Wednesday that tasted like dust and gasoline, Maya carried that jar in her worn backpack, planning to deposit it at the bank on her way home. But halfway down Miller Avenue, she saw him beside a sputtering gas pump that looked older than her grandfather. He was massive, wrapped in sun-faded leather, a wild gray beard tangled under his chin. His boots were cracked, his hands scarred and stained with engine grease. A motorcycle leaned awkwardly beside him, looking ready to collapse. In his enormous palm, he counted coins again and again, like the numbers might change if he stared long enough. Maya stopped a few steps away. She felt Papa Joe's voice in her head, "Mind your business, baby girl." But she didn't look away. Not at the faded patches on his vest or the tattoos covering his forearms, but at his eyes. Tired eyes. Eyes that had been disappointed too many times. She could have walked past. Nobody would blame a small girl for avoiding a man who looked like trouble carved from stone. But Maya had never learned to ignore someone in need. She stepped closer, jar clutched against her chest. When the man looked up, she saw frustration flash across his weathered face. He started to speak, maybe to say I'm fine or don't worry about me, but she was already unscrewing the lid with trembling fingers. She poured everything she had into his calloused palm. $3.47 in coins and crumpled bills, warm from being pressed against her side. For a moment, he just stared at the money. It looked so small in that giant hand, like a child's offering to a mountain. He tried to speak, failed, tried again. "Why?" he finally managed. Maya shrugged, like it was the simplest thing in the world. "You looked like you needed it more than me. Papa Joe says when someone needs help and you can give it, you give it. That's all." She didn't wait for thanks. Didn't ask his story. She slipped her empty jar back into her bag and walked away like she'd just shared a pencil, not her entire future in one breath. Behind her, the man, Wolf, though she didn't know his name yet, stood frozen under the buzzing fluorescent lights. The coins clinked softly in his palm, a sound that reminded him of something he'd lost years ago, faith in strangers. When her small figure disappeared around the corner, Wolf didn't climb on his bike. He didn't restart the pump. Instead, he pulled a battered phone from his vest pocket, the same pocket that once held a knife, a photo of people he'd lost, a life he'd left behind. He scrolled through contacts he hadn't touched in years. Brothers who'd ridden through hell with him, who knew what it meant when he called. He pressed one number, brought the phone to his ear. His voice cracked the silence. "Brothers, I need you to hear something." Somewhere in the distance, an engine roared to life. The next morning arrived soft and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that wouldn't break. In the small duplex, Maya swept crumbs from the chipped counter while Papa Joe hummed an old blues song that drifted through the screen door. Maya hadn't thought about the coins since yesterday. When Papa Joe asked why her jar sat empty on the windowsill, she just said, "He needed it more, Papa. I'll save again." And Papa Joe kissed her forehead the way grandfathers do when they're proud but too worried to say it. Around mid-morning, when the neighborhood settled into its usual quiet, the low rumble of a truck broke through like distant thunder. It wasn't the roar of a motorcycle or the sound of trouble. Just an old Chevy, paint faded, one headlight clouded. Maya watched from the window as the stranger climbed out. He looked smaller without his bike, though he still moved like a man who'd fought winters and won. His boots crunched gravel as he lifted 2 heavy grocery bags from the truck bed, the kind that bulged with fresh vegetables, canned goods, bread that hadn't gone stale. Papa Joe met him at the steps, one eyebrow raised the way grandfathers do when they don't trust yet. "Sir," the man said, voice rough like stones under tires. "Figured I owed you folks a thank you." Papa Joe glanced at the bags. "You the one who took my granddaughter's money?" The man smiled, just barely. "Yes, sir. Didn't mean to." She insisted. Inside, Maya pressed her face against the doorframe, watching as Papa Joe's stern expression softened just enough to wave the stranger up. They sat side by side on the weathered bench, bags resting at their feet like quiet proof the world still held surprises. He told them his name. Wolf. Just that. No last name, no explanations. Wolf, like the animal, though he'd been running from his own pack for years. He told them about roads that stretched into darkness, about brothers who wore the same colors and rode through storms together. East Coast chapters, rough places Maya only knew from movies where leather vests meant danger. Papa Joe didn't ask about that life. Just gave him the look he gave Maya when she scraped her knees, a look that asked, "Who hurt you, and why did you let them?" Wolf didn't flinch. He talked about long roads and lost friends, about nights counting miles instead of blessings. Then he turned to Maya. She came out slowly, bare feet on the porch boards, that empty jar dangling from her hand. "You shouldn't have done that," Wolf said, but there was no anger. Just softness rough men rarely show. "Giving away everything you had." Maya shrugged. "It was just money. I can save more." Wolf looked at Papa Joe, a silent question passing between them. "I owe her," he said finally, voice steady. "Not just for the gas. That jar reminded me there's still good worth protecting in this world." Papa Joe reached out, placed his weathered hand on Wolf's wrist. Not to forgive what came before, but to mark this moment, this rough giant, this gentle child, this porch that had seen too much worry. Wolf told Maya to dream bigger, that nurses save lives and maybe someday she'd help old men like him. Maya smiled, shy as sunrise. "I just want to help people. Papa Joe says when you can help, you help." Wolf sat there a long time, drinking sweet tea, listening to Maya talk about school and library books and how someday she'd wear a white coat and tell sick people they'd be okay. As the sun sank behind crooked houses, Wolf stood. "I owe you one. And I keep my debts." Maya looked up at him with clear eyes. "It was just some coins." He left before the streetlights flickered on, drove that old truck around the corner and parked under a broken lamp. Inside the cab, air thick with gasoline and old leather, Wolf pulled out his phone again. He scrolled past numbers that hadn't lit up his screen in years. Fingers trembling, he typed a message no man wearing his colors would ever ignore. "She helped me when no one would. Reminded me why we ride. I owe her everything." He hit send, closed his eyes, and waited for the thunder to answer. Wolf's message slipped through the dark like a spark seeking kindling. It buzzed in dive bars where whiskey pooled on scarred counters. It lit up screens in truck stops where men waited for dawn. It found phones in dusty garages where old bike frames hung like crucifixes. It reached brothers who'd ridden with Wolf through border towns and desert highways, through nights so cold your breath froze behind your bandana. Men who'd seen him fight when fighting was all that kept the brotherhood alive. Some hadn't spoken his name in years, not from anger, but because the road swallows certain stories. But when his words appeared, those stories rose like ghosts refusing burial. In a bar outside Reno, a biker named Chains read it aloud to 4 men hunched over cards and empty glasses. They listened in silence, nodding like priests hearing confession. "Winter of '09, Chains said, voice rough. "Wolf pulled me from a ditch when a deal went bad. Could have left me. But Wolf doesn't leave his own." In a garage outside Pittsburgh, a gray-bearded man called Diesel slid his phone across the workbench to a young prospect tightening bolts on a chopper. "Read that," Diesel said. The kid read it twice, then asked, "Who's the kid?" Diesel smiled through cracked teeth. "Doesn't matter. She's family now." At a truck stop off I-70, two brothers who'd once followed Wolf through a thunderstorm to rescue a broken-down rider stared at their buzzing phone. They ordered more coffee, called old contacts on numbers scribbled inside vest pockets. And everywhere, in every smoky bar and dim garage, they remembered the same oath, spoken soft, never written. One rider down, all riders rise. It didn't matter that Wolf hadn't ridden with them in years. What mattered was he'd called. And they answered. They pulled out maps, marked towns with marker, called in favors from men who owed them more than money. Emptied toolboxes, packed saddlebags, filled gas tanks until the pumps clicked empty. In one bar, a man named Red leaned against a pool table and asked the question nobody needed answered. "We gonna let this kid think she saved a ghost and that's it?" The room answered with scraping chairs. The clink of unfinished beers set down. Someone muttered. "She gave him $3. We'll give her an army." They agreed. Rough men with soft hearts hidden under skulls and wings. They'd show this kid what brotherhood looks like when it parks on your lawn like a promise. Some packed blankets. Some packed toys their kids had outgrown. Some just packed themselves and the road dust that clung like proof they'd never left the highway. When the last call was made, when the last map was folded into vest pockets, the first engines turned over in the dead of night. Headlights flared in the darkness. Carburetors coughed. Pipes rattled windows that hadn't known such thunder in years. One by one, steel horses roared into the night, a string of flickering taillights stitched across sleeping highways. Bound for the duplex where a tired grandfather and a girl with an empty jar waited for kindness they never asked to be repaid. And in the silence between engines and dawn, a rumor moved through America's back roads. Somewhere out there, a young girl pressed coins into a stranger's palm. And in doing so, woke an army of rough men who'd been waiting for one last chance to prove the world wrong about them. When dawn broke through Maya's curtains, the house felt different, like the walls held their breath. Papa Joe was already awake, perched at the window, blanket clutched around his shoulders. Maya stirred at the low rumble, not a bus or delivery truck, but something deeper, layered, alive. It pulsed through the floorboards, vibrated in her chest like a drum she couldn't name. "Baby girl," Papa Joe called softly. "You might want to see this." Maya slipped from bed, feet brushing cold linoleum. She padded to the living room where lace curtains danced in the draft. Papa Joe didn't speak. He just nodded toward the window. Maya pressed small fingers to the glass. Outside, where cracked sidewalk met gutter choked with leaves, there was no street left to see. Only chrome and leather. Beards and patches. Heavy boots planted in dirt yards. Rows upon rows of motorcycles, engines cooling as men swung thick legs over iron saddles until the block looked less like a neighborhood and more like a rally ground. They didn't shout. Didn't rev engines or blast music. They just stood, a silent sea of worn denim and black leather cracked by years on highways. Tattooed knuckles shoved in pockets. Some smoked, ember tips glowing. Some nodded without words, eyes fixed on the small porch. Word slipped quick through the street. Neighbors cracked doors, peeked through blinds. Old Mrs. Chen shuffled out in slippers, mouth hanging open. A mother down the block pulled her child inside by the collar. And a patrol car rolled slow along the curb, officer behind the wheel nervous, knuckles white on the steering wheel. Inside, Maya turned wide eyes to Papa Joe. His hand rested heavy on her shoulder, steadying them both. Then came the knock. Soft for knuckles like Wolf's, but heavy enough to break the silence. Papa Joe flinched. Maya held her breath as Wolf's shadow settled against the frosted glass. He didn't pound, didn't demand. Just waited, hat in hand. When the door opened, Wolf dipped his head. He looked older in morning light, jacket zipped tight, hair pulled back, eyes ringed with sleepless miles. "Papa Joe," he said, voice graveled but warm. "Don't be afraid. They're not here for trouble." Papa Joe's jaw tightened. "Then what are they here for?" Wolf turned to Maya, whose jar sat empty by her bed while the street overflowed with iron and thunder. "They're here for her. To pay back what can't rightly be paid." Maya blinked, unable to understand how a few coins could ripple so wide, how her small mercy cracked open a man's heart and summoned a brotherhood that hadn't gathered like this in years. Behind Wolf, engines idled quietly. Boots scraped gravel. Riders pulled off gloves, passing things between calloused palms, folded papers, envelopes, tokens worn smooth by years. From the middle of that leather tide, one biker stepped forward. Beard caught the wind like tangled stories, vest thick with patches like armor. He pulled a piece of paper from his back pocket, edges oil-smudged, corners soft from too many folds. He held it out to Wolf, who glanced at it and nodded once, sharp and certain. Wolf turned back to Papa Joe and Maya, laying the paper gently in the old man's weathered hands. "This here," Wolf said, voice low but carrying, "is the plan. Time you knew what family really means." Papa Joe's fingers trembled. Maya leaned closer, breath caught like a held prayer. Outside, 1,000 bikes stood patient, engines cooling, hearts warming, waiting. By the time the sun finished climbing, the air didn't smell of fear. It smelled of warm engines beside charcoal fires, of leather carrying stories, of laughter cracking in places where only silence used to live. It started small. One biker stepped forward, broad-shouldered, silver chain around his neck. He dug into his pocket, pulled out an envelope sealed with duct tape. He held it out to Maya with both hands. Maya looked at Papa Joe. His eyes said, "Take it, baby." So she did. Tiny fingers closing around something heavier than its weight. The biker nodded, "You earned this," and stepped aside. Another came forward, shorter, round belly pressing against vest snaps. He pressed a small pouch into her palm. It clinked. "Belonged to my mama," he rasped. "She'd want you to have it." And so they came. Not all at once, but in a slow line that curled around the porch, down broken steps, across the patch of lawn. Some brought folded bills. Some slipped gift cards with awkward smiles. One man pressed a silver dollar into her palm, worn smooth by years. "Kept me alive more than once. Reckon it'll do the same for you." Maya didn't know what to say. Just whispered thank you like a prayer. They told her pieces of themselves. Nights spent cold. Fights that left scars. Families that turned them out and roads that took them in. One voice cracked, "I was 16 when Wolf found me behind a gas station half frozen. Taught me to ride. Taught me to stand straight. You did that for him, kid." Another muttered, "We're all lost sometimes. Takes one good soul to remind you the road leads home." Through it all, Wolf stood to the side, arms crossed, eyes soft at the corners. When the last envelope was passed, when the last rough hand squeezed Maya's shoulder, Wolf stepped forward. He pressed a thick packet straight into Papa Joe's hands. "Count it when you're ready. Pay what's owed. Put the rest toward her schooling. She's got dreams. Let's keep them bigger than a jar." Papa Joe held it to his chest, paper crinkling. His eyes glistened, but his voice stayed firm. "You didn't have to." Wolf only shook his head. "I did. She did for me. Now we do for her." As if on signal, the silence broke. Engines growled. Laughter rolled down the block, and hands reached for coolers in saddlebags. Somebody dragged out a grill, balanced it on cinder blocks. Another pulled hot dogs from a bag. One biker called for a hammer, and in minutes, nails rang into fence posts that had sagged for years. Neighbors gathered in doorways, confusion melting to curiosity. A boy crept onto the lawn, wide-eyed. A biker lifted him onto a seat, let him twist the throttle once. The roar burst through the boy's laughter like fireworks. Grills sizzled. Broken steps were mended by men who once swung wrenches on choppers but now swung hammers. Someone painted over the peeling door frame, bright white covering years of neglect. Papa Joe tried to protest. "You don't have to do all this." Wolf shook his head again. "We protect what protects us. Simple as that." And so the block party bloomed, loud enough to echo through forgotten corners. For once, Maya's duplex didn't feel like the tired end of a tired street. It felt like the center of something bigger, a promise stitched from engine oil and leather, from rough hands building where once they'd broken. But not every window held a smile. Some eyes narrowed at the patches, the boots, the roar. And somewhere behind drawn blinds, a voice dialed 3 numbers. While Maya laughed for the first time in months, a question curled through the block like cold draft. What happens when the world decides kindness looks too rough to trust? As the day stretched, what started as engines and quiet men spread beyond Maya's block. Word slipped under doors that rough men had parked beside a poor girl's porch, that hands that once swung chains now patched fences and flipped burgers. But kindness, real unpolished kindness, rattles people who've only known roughness to come with strings. Sideways glances from tidy lawns. Lawnmowers paused. Whispers crawled over phone lines. Who are they? What do they want? Squad cars rolled through in slow loops, lights off but presence loud. Officers watched, 2 per cruiser, eyes hidden behind mirrored shades reflecting rows of bikes. Then came news vans. Antennas scraping branches. Reporters spilled out, notepads flapping. Cameramen lugged tripods across Papa Joe's grass. Microphones buzzed. Behind a tangle of cables, a reporter with too much makeup leaned toward her cameraman. Get the girl's name. Get her on tape. She's the hook. They called Maya forward, waving her over, then thrusting mics like weapons. She hesitated, clutching her shirt, eyes flitting from Wolf to Papa Joe. Wolf stood behind her, arms crossed, boots planted. Not menacing. Just there, a wall of rough mercy. The camera's red light blinked. The reporter bent low, voice syrupy. Honey, tell us why they're here. Aren't you scared? Maya's shoulders tensed. She glanced at Wolf, who gave her a nod, slow, steady, telling her she was braver than any of them. She cleared her throat, voice trembling at first. They're not here to scare us. They're family now. That's all. The reporter opened her mouth for another question, something slick. But Wolf stepped beside Maya, broad shoulders blocking the lens. His shadow fell over the microphone. He looked into the camera, not blinking. This kid gave more than any of us ever did. She gave without asking. We're just paying it forward the only way we know how. Folks scared of that ought to ask why they'd fear a good thing just 'cause it looks different. Behind the camera, murmurs stilled. Papa Joe squeezed Maya's hand so tight her knuckles shone white. The bikers shifted boots on gravel, a quiet reminder that brotherhood doesn't flinch when the world points lights and questions. Yet suspicion always finds a way. At the lawn's edge, fresh squad cars rumbled. One door opened with a squeal. An officer stepped out, tall, fresh-faced, academy nerves clinging to his collar. He scanned the yard, the vans, the vests lining the street. His gaze settled on Wolf. Boots crunched across the yard. He came close enough to catch smoke from the grill, cleared his throat. Sir, going to have to ask you to wrap this up. Neighbors are complaining. Too much noise, too much worry. Wolf didn't move. He looked past the officer's shoulder, at Maya, at Papa Joe's porch fixed fresh, at bikes lined up like sentinels. He exhaled long and slow, measuring how much road he could stretch before the law called it done. And in that tight silence, the promise of thunder held its breath, waiting to see if kindness could stand its ground. By late afternoon, the street felt softer, not quieter but changed. Grills hissed to embers. The last burger flipped onto a paper plate for a barefoot boy who swore he'd never forget this day. Bikers checked straps, kicked tires, tugged at leather sleeves. Boots scuffed the curb where hours ago they'd stood like an army with nothing but kindness for ammunition. They didn't say long goodbyes. Men like this never did. Instead, they lingered in small groups, heads bent over Maya's shoulders, voices rough but gentle as they pressed gifts into her hands. One man, road name stitched as stitch, peeled a patch from his vest. He bent low, pinned it to Maya's sleeve. Means you're family now. Means you ride with us even standing still. Another passed her a chain with a tiny silver cross. Kept me safe through 3 states and 2 bad nights. Figured it ought to keep you safe too. Some handed coins, old biker superstition, road money from a brother. Others slipped stickers, pins, hand-carved trinkets made in prison workshops or behind gas stations. Papa Joe stood at the steps, arms folded to keep the wind from knowing how his bones trembled. Wolf climbed those steps last, boots thudding on fresh boards. He didn't speak first, just opened his arms wide. Papa Joe let him fold him in, old man and older soul, holding tight. "If anyone ever messes with her," Wolf murmured, "they mess with us." Papa Joe pulled back to see his eyes, softer now, tired but burning with promise. He nodded once, a quiet amen. Maya stood back, tokens cupped to her chest, watching as Wolf swung onto his bike. Boots thunked pavement that yesterday felt like the end of the world and today felt like a beginning. Engines fired one by one, a soft rumble rolling under doorsteps. The convoy didn't roar. They drifted off slow, handlebars steady, patches catching wind like flags from an army that left no battle. Only rebuilt porches and hammered fence posts. Maya's eyes followed until the last chrome glint blinked out behind the stop sign. She didn't wave. Some goodbyes stay stitched under your skin, humming soft. By the time the street fell silent, neighbors peeked out again, curiosity replacing fear. Kids tiptoed onto Maya's lawn, brushing fingers over tire marks like relics from a dream too bright to last. Maya turned back to the porch, Papa Joe's hand warm on her back. They stepped through a doorway newly painted, hinges no longer squeaking. It wasn't until Maya reached her bedroom, coins and patches clutched to her chest, that she found it tucked under her pillow, a single folded note, grease-smudged, her name scratched across in Wolf's rough scroll. She held it, listening to distant engines curling down roads she'd never see, roads that now somehow always circle back. She unfolded it slow, careful. Inside, only a handful of lines. "Keep helping people. Someday you'll wear your own patch. Wolf." Simple as that. A promise that kindness rides longer than any road. That mercy sticks to a soul like engine oil under fingernails. Time rolled on. The fence stayed mended. The porch stayed bright. Papa Joe's laugh came easier. Maya took that thunder and turned it outward. Some money stayed sealed for school. But the rest, she poured back into the cracks that birthed her. A pantry grew under the old carport, shelves stacked with cans, boxes, fresh bread. Kids from 3 streets over lined up, shy at first, then braver. No questions asked. Just a bag in hand and hope slipped in like loose change. Sometimes at dusk, when the street dipped quiet, the silence would break just enough. The distant roll of a single engine weaving through side streets, never stopping long. Wolf never knocked, never lingered. A lone figure under a helmet, chrome flickering like an old ghost. A reminder stitched in engine noise that some debts pay themselves forward forever. Inside her room, taped to the mirror, Wolf's note stayed where she could see it every dawn. A road map in rough words. A reminder that even a coin jar labeled dreams can build something bigger than itself. The block never forgot. How one small gesture cracked open an army's heart. How a girl with dirt under her nails and hope in her palms turned a tired corner into a warm beacon. One small act, and 1,000 roaring reminders that even the roughest souls remember who showed them grace. This story may be done, but yours isn't. Subscribe. Share it with someone who needs reminding that small acts echo far. Thanks for watching.